The air was already thick with unease when a swelling crowd began to converge near Portland's Central District just after noon. What began as a loosely gathered demonstration rapidly transformed into a volatile clash. Reports say a group of individuals, allegedly undocumented immigrants, initiated a surge toward the city's government center. Their aim, unclear at first, was later speculated to be a protest against recent legislative measures perceived to target migrant communities. Yet within moments, the demonstration turned into something else entirely. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. Barricades were pushed aside, windows rattled under pressure, and voices rose not in chant but in chaotic defiance. Officials on the ground scrambled to assess the threat, but it quickly outpaced them. Portland's municipal complex, symbolic in its function and visibility, became the epicenter of a flashpoint that neither local law enforcement nor residents had anticipated that day. Law enforcement had already been stretched thin by a string of protests earlier in the month. But this incident had a different tone. Aggression charged through the air, not just frustration. Witnesses described a series of aggressive breaches. Building doors kicked in, office windows shattered, fire alarms triggered in a deliberate frenzy. The suddenness of the assault stunned even seasoned officers. Local units, overwhelmed, radioed for federal assistance. And that's when the Deportation Troops arrived. A heavily equipped tactical unit under the jurisdiction of immigration enforcement, colloquially referred to as Deportation Troops, was deployed within an hour. Their arrival was swift, methodical, and unflinchingly direct. Clad in armored uniforms, wielding riot-grade weaponry and shields, they stormed the plaza with precision honed through years of border conflict operations. What unfolded next would dominate national discourse for days, if not weeks. The troops responded not with measured containment, but with a show of overwhelming dominance. Gas canisters were launched into the crowd almost immediately. Loud warnings were issued, but drowned out by the screams and panic that followed the detonation of flashbangs. The crowd, now caught between the momentum of its initial aggression and the raw force of militarized control, spiraled into pandemonium. Men and women were tackled to the ground with a brutality that left even observers stunned. Drone footage later showed individuals being dragged across concrete, limbs bent at unnatural angles, faces bloodied. Federal agents struck with batons, some in synchronized formation, clearing paths toward the building with the unwavering goal of reclaiming it at any cost. It wasn't just crowd control, it was eradication of opposition. Cameras captured one particularly jarring moment when a protester, mid-scream, was struck squarely in the torso by a projectile round and collapsed as others scattered around him. The implications of such a response reverberated immediately. Portland, a city long associated with activism, now bore the scars of a brutal reminder. The federal apparatus had shifted from surveillance to swift public intervention. No attempt at negotiation was reported, and no safe corridor for exit was visibly provided. Individuals caught in the crossfire, some reportedly not participating in the unrest, found themselves swept up in the crackdown. This raised questions about proportionality, collateral harm, and the evolving definition of domestic enforcement. Observers on the ground described scenes that echoed the kind of anti-insurgency campaigns usually reserved for foreign operations. The federal unit operated with battlefield tactics, dividing the crowd into isolated segments, cornering them with shield walls, and flushing them out with tactical force. Detainees were zip-tied en masse, lined against walls or confined to mobile detention vans that rolled in behind the enforcement line like a second wave of conquest. Even within the ranks of law enforcement, murmurs of concern reportedly circulated. Some Portland officers, accustomed to handling protests with de-escalation strategies, found themselves temporarily subordinated to a command style foreign to their training. What had begun as a localized disturbance was no longer within the city's jurisdiction. It had been commandeered by a federal response that operated outside the bounds of community familiarity. There was a quiet but notable transformation in the atmosphere of the city following the event. Though no aftermath is the focus here, the event itself planted a seed of apprehension. Citizens who witnessed the incident firsthand described the arrival of the troops as a wave of war. Not a metaphor, but a literal observation. The sound of helicopters overhead, the synchronized boots striking pavement, the scent of pepper spray mixed with panic and smoke. At the heart of this confrontation was a clash of paradigms. One group viewed itself as voicing an existential outcry against removal, against marginalization, against the threat of invisibility. The other acted with a doctrine of zero tolerance, shaped by years of policy built around deterrence and exemplified by immediate domination. This wasn't just a skirmish. It was a philosophical and physical collision of worldviews. Human rights versus state security, protest versus insurgency, presence versus erasure. As the plaza was cleared and the last of the crowds were corralled into submission, what settled over Portland was not merely quiet, but a weight. The air still carried the sting of chemical dispersants, but heavier than that was the tension that lingered. An ambient dread born from witnessing something that felt disproportionate, something that felt less like a reaction and more like a demonstration of power designed to dominate far beyond the moment. In those early hours following the confrontation, silence wasn't born out of peace, but out of shock. The streets, usually bustling with conversation and the motion of daily life, had become oddly muted. Shops closed their doors early. Office buildings remained vacant longer than usual. It wasn't fear of the crowd that kept people indoors. It was the stark memory of how the response had unfolded. Residents described the entire episode with language more commonly reserved for military incursions. Incursion, siege, shock campaign. These were not exaggerations in their minds, but reflections of a reality that had unfolded in front of them with jarring clarity. The presence of the federal force hadn't just interrupted the event, it had eclipsed it. Whatever message the original group had intended to deliver, whether rooted in desperation or defiance, was immediately erased by the velocity and ferocity of the counter-response. The focus turned from the grievances of the crowd to the tactics used to neutralize them. No demands were negotiated, no chants heard, no speeches made. It was a blackout of voices under the glare of tactical efficiency. In the span of mere hours, a civic space transformed into a symbol of federal supremacy. That transition did not require political commentary to be evident. It was seen in the way people stared at government buildings afterward, no longer as centers of civic administration, but as bastions protected by forces that answered not to local control, but to higher, more distant chains of command. The presence of that distinction between the local and the federal was suddenly visceral. Even those who supported stricter immigration enforcement found themselves struck by the scale of what had occurred. The question wasn't about legality or borders anymore. It had shifted to method, to proportionality, to intent. What exactly was being defended when the defense itself became indistinguishable from an offensive campaign? The agents who had arrived were faceless, shielded, moving in practiced formations like a machine designed to suppress rather than to understand. There was no communication, no parley, not even an effort to break the crowd apart with instructions or options. The response was rooted in assumption that the entirety of the assembly was a threat, that everybody present was a combatant, that every movement not away from the building was toward destruction. It was the kind of logic that simplifies the landscape of civil unrest into something black and white, obedience or eradication. The cityscape too bore the evidence of this logic. Benches were splintered, flower beds torn, security cameras dangling like casualties of a skirmish, their wires exposed and lifeless. Even traffic lights had been damaged in the chaos, as if the confrontation had spread its violence to anything within reach. It was not limited to human interaction. It was a rupture that had little regard for the physical or emotional fabric of the place it tore through. In the days that followed, without needing to discuss what came after, the city began moving differently. People crossed the street away from government buildings instinctively. A hesitance entered the way conversations were held in public. You could feel it in the way voices dropped in tone near police vehicles or how eyes trailed longer over federal insignias. What stood out too was the absence of nuance. Once the troops arrived, the entire narrative narrowed. There were no categories left, no room for bystanders, mediators, or journalists. All were subject to the same treatment. This obliteration of role blurred any boundary between activism, agitation, and simple presence. The space for ambiguity vanished, replaced with an ironclad certainty that all who remained would be treated the same way, as enemies. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the Deportation Troops' brutal response in Portland? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.